Well, isn't all this sunshine this morning glorious? And there's so much sunshine, if we ignore the snow outside, we can pretend like we're in the Bahamas instead, right? Could do that. The great Christian author, C.S. Lewis, is probably best known for his children's books, like the Chronicles of Narnia series. But you know, he was first and foremost an Oxford professor and a brilliant theologian. And he was also a lifelong confirmed bachelor. And so his friends, like the author J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote the Lord of the Rings series, they were completely flabbergasted, completely caught off guard when at the age of 58, Lewis announced that he was going to be marrying an American fan of his who had come over to visit him in England. And her name was Joy. You know, at first, Lewis married her simply because he enjoyed their intellectual conversations, kind of the theological back and forth. She really stimulated his intellect. And also because her visa was running out, too. But you know, what began as merely a legal arrangement gradually turned into a real, authentic love. Now, most people who knew them suspect that Joy actually loved Lewis right from the start. But for Lewis himself, this love, this personal happiness that he experienced totally surprised him, caught him completely unaware. Years later, when Lewis was writing his autobiography, he titled it, Surprised by Joy. You know, a lot of folks at the time presumed that the title was referring to his wife. But in reality, the title refers to a different joy that took him by surprise much earlier in his life. And as a young man, Lewis was an avowed atheist, in part at least because he thought that trying to live a Christian life would just be too difficult, too hard. And so he was completely surprised when entirely out of the blue one day he felt inspired to surrender himself to the love of God. And he experienced in that surrender a happiness that he'd never known before. Later, when he was writing about that conversion experience, Lewis said this, "Startled into self-forgetfulness, I finally tasted pure joy." Joy in the Lord. Joy in the Lord. You know, today's gospel, of course, is also about a marriage, a wedding that Jesus and his disciples attended in Cana. Now, like C.S. Lewis and his wife Joy, it's pretty likely that the bride and the groom in the story didn't really know each other all that well when they were getting married. Most marriages in ancient Israel were prearranged by the parents when the bride and groom were very young, or at least they were prearranged by a local matchmaker. But who knows? Maybe they were also surprised by Joy as they entered into their marriage and that lifelong process of deepening love that it requires. But you know, there's a lot more going on in this gospel story than simply a family wedding celebration taking place in some small village in Galilee. The wedding feast at Cana reveals an important truth about God's desire to be one with his people, to be united with you and I in a new relationship of love. It's really interesting, too, that Jesus makes the wine from the water that's reserved for the ceremonial washings that the scribes said everyone was required to do. We know, too, that the Pharisees in particular had become almost obsessed with these ceremonial washings. They thought that if they did the washings perfectly, according to the exacting details as laid out by the scribes, well, then they were holy men. They were righteous in God's eyes. Now, of course, they also believed the opposite to be true. The Pharisees believed that anyone who didn't do the washings exactly perfectly as the scribes said they should be done was a terrible sinner, someone who was unrighteous in God's eyes, someone who was unworthy of his love, unworthy to even enter the temple. And so this growing obsession with the ritual washings and all these hundreds of laws that the scribes wrote and had imposed on people, well, it was leaving a lot of people feeling unclean or unworthy of God's love. So when Mary observed that the wine had run out, one theologian said it was almost like she was lamenting the fact that when it came to the faith in those days, the joy had run out. The joy had run dry for a lot of people. In other words, Mary knew that faith is not about the perfect observation of rules and regulations, as if that's the only thing that matters, like the Pharisees thought. No, she knew that faith is first and foremost about a relationship of love with God, in particular, a relationship of love with her Son, with our Savior Jesus Christ. So the Pharisees, they may have washed their hands perfectly, but they certainly hadn't given their lives and their hearts to God in any kind of relationship of love. Their hearts were notoriously stone cold. They lacked any compassion, any love or mercy for other people. And that means that their perfect ritual observations of those washings and the like were meaningless, completely meaningless in God's eyes. Now, of course, we can fall into that same trap sometimes too. And that's why Mary wants Jesus to reveal who he truly is to all those people at that wedding, and to us too, of course, so they can experience a return of hope and joy in their relationship with God. So the wedding at Cana shows how God is offering us a relationship with him based on love and faith and hope. In Jesus' presence, those huge jars of water for the ritual purifying of hands began to overflow instead with wine for rejoicing. And he's offering to make that same kind of change for each one of us too within our hearts. In other words, there might be times in our life and in our spiritual life even when we feel kind of empty or distant or remote from God or incomplete in some way. And we know that no matter how hard we try, we're never going to be able to attain perfection in our holiness and in our pursuit of holiness in our spiritual life by our own efforts. That perfection is beyond our grasp. It's beyond our reach. And so that means in our relationships, in our work, and in our hearts and our lives, it might sometimes feel like the joy has kind of run out or run dry, that we don't have anything left to give to anyone else. Well, if that's the case, then we do what the people have done for centuries. We turn to Jesus in our emptiness, in our incompleteness. More than anything, Mary longs for us to see Christ's glory and for us to put our entire trust in him, to give him our entire heart, every aspect of our life. And of course, what she said in the gospel today, she says to you and us every single day, do whatever he tells you. Do whatever he tells you. We are about to see Jesus in all his glory right on this altar and to actually receive him into ourselves in Holy Communion. That means that this Mass, every Mass for that matter, is our chance to begin again, to start new, to accept Jesus' healing and forgiveness, to give him our hearts, to give him our lives, and to allow his Spirit to fill our hearts so that the joy can overflow once again.